Welcome back to the Daily Dose of Septuagint, and excited to have another special Saturday edition where we're continuing to take a look at Codex Sinaiticus. This will be our last one for now in this little mini-series. We'll come back to it, of course, down the road. And as you may recall, this codex was discovered in the sort of mid to late 1800s in this particular monastery, St. Catherine's, in the lower Sinai Peninsula, although the manuscript itself dates back to the mid to late 4th century, or perhaps thereafter. If you want to find images, you can go to codexsinaiticus.org. Now, though it was found largely here, most of it is housed at the British Museum in London, although portions of it are found elsewhere. And today we're going to do two things. We're going to take a look at the contents of this particular codex, and then an interesting verse from the book of Isaiah, and in fact compare it to Codex Vaticanus. Let's begin with the contents. What's in this pandect Bible? By pandect, we mean it has both the Old and the New Testament. Now, on the New Testament side, it is essentially intact. Not every verse necessarily is present due to wear and tear in the manuscript, but on the Old Testament side, it's a bit of a different story. Similar to Vaticanus, some of the early books are not intact, largely due to wear and tear, although if you remember from the intro video when Tischendorf found it, it's a little bit unclear what exactly was happening to it, what it was being used for. And so the first chunk of it, large sections of the initial books, are no longer in existence. But we do have portions of Genesis. We don't have any surviving fragments of Exodus in the existing sort of remnant of it, although without a doubt it originally had Exodus. No one would sort of assume otherwise. Portions of Leviticus have survived, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, but none of them are fully intact. Once we get to Ruth through 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, which is in our way of thinking based on the Hebrew, 1st and 2nd Kings, those are absent, although they probably did form part of the original codex, but for whatever reason, that grouping of folios has been lost. There are portions of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The book known as Esdras B, or 2nd Esdras, which is really Ezra and Nehemiah, it is also not fully intact. But after that, we start to have a bit more completeness, and so we do have Esther. Notice the kind of strange order here. We'll come back to the Apocryphal books in a second. We have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and for unclear reasons, Ezekiel is absent. Then we have the 12 prophets, but it's missing Hosea. That's odd. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and then Job in terms of the traditional canonical books. But as you can see, when it comes to the so-called Apocrypha or deuterocanonical books, it does not actually have Esdras A. That's the kind of remix of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a Greek composition that tells the same story, but it's clearly, and is derived from the canonical books, but is kind of doing its own thing. It does have Tobit, Judith, 1st Maccabees, and 4th Maccabees. Surprisingly, 2nd Maccabees is not present, and that's kind of unusual. And then you have Wisdom of Solomon and the Wisdom of Sirach. Also, we have Psalm 151. I didn't list that here, but we'll look at that down the road. So what's interesting about this, especially if you compare it back to Vaticanus, is that their inclusion of these so-called apocryphal books is very inconsistent. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus don't match in terms of which ones they have, let alone the order that they're in. And so that is one of a variety of reasons why the notion that there was a broader canon of the Old Testament within the Greek-speaking world, the so-called Alexandrian canon, has largely fallen by the wayside. The data simply doesn't support that. They were circulating these books, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had the same sort of intrinsic authority as the other books. Now let's take a look at some of the earlier folios just to show you the state of things for those books that were marked with asterisks. So you can see this is one surviving page, but even it's not complete, or here's another example. Notice how incomplete it is, and these are just very loose fragments from the earlier books in Codex Sinaiticus. Now let's take a look at some of these apocryphal books. So what I'm showing you here on the screen is the transition from Tobit to Judith. And so let's zoom in. This is what Tobit looks like. And so we tend to spell it with a T-O-B-I-T, but notice it's an omega, at least the way this scribe spelled it, an E-I, which is a fairly common sort of atticizing E-I spelling, and then a theta there at the end is very small. But the scribe here, as he got to the end of Tobit, did sort of a standard Coronis, little footer here to show that it's the end of the book, did a nice little subscript book title, just to round things out. Pretty customary for the scribe, not nearly as decorated as for Vaticanus. And if we go up to the top, you'll see the start of Judith. If you remember back to Vaticanus, they had all sorts of coloration and decorated letters, but here it's fairly simple. It's the iota, omicron, upsilon, delta. Once again, we have that EI, theta to spell Judith with some little decorative stuff around it. So it's much more subdued there. If we move a little bit further in, we will see the transition from Judith down here to First Maccabees. So we can zoom in. Here's how they ended the book of Judith, the same spelling as before. And then you have Maccabeon Alpha here. You see that alpha with a line over it signifying this is First Maccabees, or it's really one of the Maccabees as a genitive plural. And then they begin the book. Now we go to a couple more apocryphal books. We see the end of Sophia, and it's kind of hard to make out here, but this says Salomontas. This is wisdom of Solomon. Solomon's name is somewhat famously spelled in a lot of different ways in Greek, partly due to the way it's spelled in Hebrew. So this is the end of the wisdom of Solomon. If you go to the top of the page here, you'll see also another running header for wisdom of Solomon. However, the wisdom of Ben Sira, also known as Sirach, starts right here. And so it's kind of interesting that they sort of put this header at the top to include the whole page, but actually a whole new book starts. However, for the start of this new book, there is no title. We're going to see that actually on the next page. And this is the prologue, including what was on the prior column. There's a very famous prologue of Ben Sira, or Wisdom of Ben Sira, and the scribe includes that. Notice there's actually textual variants and stuff being marked up in it as well. It has its own textual history. Then the sort of book proper starts here, so we can zoom into that. And it says the Sophia Jesu Huiu Sirach, which we often spell in English Sirach like that. And so it's Jesus ben Sira, and that was the very famous Jewish rabbi's name. Now let's take a look at a verse from Isaiah 28:16. And this just happens to be an interesting verse. I've done some work on this. This is one of the stone passages. And so we'll notice that there's a paragraph number here, which I'll give you in just a second. It's a rho C delta. See a nice little ekthesis here to begin a new division. In fact, you see these dots out to the side. Don't confuse those for some sort of text critical thing. This is actually where they would essentially kind of prick the parchment to enable them to draw their nice lines and keep everything nice and even. So you can see that on some of the pages of this manuscript. Let's start out by reading it. And we'll begin here with a dia, and then we have tuta, hutos. So dia, tuta, hutos. On account of this, thus, and by the way, the number there is 164. Of course, this doesn't remotely correspond to our modern day chapter numbers. And the next line, lege, and then we have a nomen sacrum. We've seen that in prior videos. So that's a kappa followed by a lunate sigma with the overbar. So that's kyrios. So thus says the Lord. And then we begin, I sort of have to uncover it here, idu, behold, and then ego, I, behold, I. So here's the transcription. So lege kyrios. Notice I've just included the rest of the letters there that are abbreviated. Behold, I. All right, what's next? Embalo. So E-M-B-A, there's an L, omega. And this is a liquid future with the circumflex on the omega, at least in the way we would put it. So I will place, or I will set. And it's ace, and then ta. So it's a plural neuter article there. And then we begin the next word, which is the. We haven't finished it yet. What is it? It's themelia. And that is the word for foundation, but here it's plural, so it's the foundations. And it's the foundations of what? Then we have Seon. Now, that may not look terribly familiar. You probably haven't learned a word for that necessarily, but that is actually Zion. Remember, this is a lunate sigma. And so that's a very common way that the city Zion is spelled, as opposed to having it be zeta. Typically, it was spelled with a sigma in Greek. And then we have that EI spelling. You're not going to see that in all the manuscripts, but this particular scribe tends to prefer that. So he's laying in the foundations of Zion. Then we start the next word, which is a L-I here. And how does it finish? Lithon, that is stone. I'm laying a stone. And what kind of stone is it? Palutele, which basically means valuable. So it's a lithon palutele. So it's a very valuable or precious stone. And then what else do we find out about this stone? It's eklekton, so it's chosen. That's the word for like elect or chosen there. And then we have akro, which technically means corner, and then goniaion. So it's a eklekton acrogoniaion, which is a bit of a difficult word, but that basically means the head of the corner or the cornerstone, if you will. And so we now have a chosen and precious cornerstone. And then we have one more word here, entomon, which also essentially is almost synonymous for palotele, means sort of precious or highly valued or something like that. So it's a very, very important stone that is being placed in Zion. Now, what is it for? We have an ace, sort of expressing purpose here. It's as. Then we have ta, although that alpha is a little bit difficult to read. And then we have themeli. Notice he shrunk the font here, so to speak, to fit that in. And then we have a final alpha. I guess he couldn't fit that one in. So as the foundations, and then it's altes here, the genitive singular feminine, because Zion morphologically, or at least in terms of its grammatical gender, is feminine. So as her, but it's really its foundations, plural there, once again. And then we have an interesting sort of raised dot here. Sometimes you'll see that as a period in Greek editions, but it's technically a raised dot or a middle stop of some sort. Then chi, ha, the article. Notice there's no breathing mark. Sinaiticus is it rarely has that kind of stuff, whereas we saw more of that in Vaticanus. So ha, and then we have pi. Notice the top bar there is rather faint. You might have thought that was just yoda, 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 but there is a crossbar there. Here we have a sigma, although it's a little bit smudged. It's pistuon. So it's ha pistuon. That is a nominative singular masculine present active participle, the one who believes. And I'm going to focus in on this ep alto. And so you see that over here. Notice the I of epi has dropped out due to a lesion. You don't see an apostrophe like you would in a modern edition. And then technically this is dative, and you just sort of know that because epi often takes the dative. There is no iota subscript though, nor is there a iota adscript. Some scribes might add a iota out to the side. That's a terrible iota. Let's try again. But not this particular scribe. Sinaiticus doesn't typically do that, nor do they subscript it either. That's not going to be typical in the majuscule script. And then so the one who believes upon it, upon this stone. Of course, it's a messianic stone, if you know the later trajectory here, shows up in 1 Peter and so on. Then we have may, so certainly will not, kataskun the, will not be ashamed, and then that's where that verse ends, and it keeps going. So here the prophet is anticipating how the Lord is going to place in Zion this stone, and if you believe in this stone, then you won't be ashamed, and so on. And as I mentioned, that is not only cited in 1 Peter 2, but it shows up in Romans 9 as well, and is clearly unpacked as a sort of messianic stone. Now, this epalto there, though, is quite interesting. Let's compare this with Vaticanus. And so this is the exact same passage from the Vatican Codex, and we won't read it all again. I'm just going to draw your attention to compare really this believing in it. So let's go back and say an kai ha pistuon, and then ep alto, which we see in Sinaiticus, and that's what you're going to see, for instance, in Paul's rendering. If we go over, however, to Vaticanus here on the right, you're going to say, okay, chi, just sort of zoom down, chi, ha. You see that? Notice they do have a breathing mark in this one. And then we have pistuon, so far so good, but there is no ep alto here. Just go straight into me kataiskun. Just the one who believes will not be put to shame. It doesn't have a believe in it. And that's really quite interesting because in the original Hebrew, there is no object of the verb for believe. You start to see it enter into the picture in some of the Greek tradition, but not all of it. In other words, the Vaticanus form is a little bit closer to the Masoretic. However, the Targums and some other traditions also were starting to include an object of the belief. Now, the Targums post-date, for instance, the New Testament and so forth, but there could have been a kind of exegetical tradition that's ultimately behind what we see here in Sinaiticus that we don't see in Vaticanus. And so otherwise, these two manuscripts are basically identical here with that exception, but it's a really important exception in terms of the object of belief. So just thought I'd point that out. You'll see this reflected in the various critical apparatuses that'll mention that ep alto is found in some but not in others. But this shows you what it looks like in the wild. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this initial foray into Codex Sinaiticus, and we'll move on to other things, but it's been fun to take a look at this very important and very interesting manuscript.